Okay, everybody, good afternoon. So, how are you guys doing today? How are things?
Going well. How about yourself?
Thanks, Alan. Doing pretty well. I have allergies, and because it's not very cold yet during the day here, I'm having allergy issues. So, I may have a little bit of trouble speaking up, but I'll try and speak up. Um, I'm looking forward to reading your essays on Barefoot again. I think it's going to be really interesting to see what you came up with. Um, so let me kind of just ask you guys before we talk about the essay itself. You had a chance, hopefully, to finish the whole book. Let me just sort of ask you, um, looking at the whole book overall, what are some of your thoughts about the book? How did you, how did the reading the book go? Um, did you still like the book, even though you've read all the way to the end? Just thoughts about the book.
I thought it was pretty good. It wasn't a bad read. I actually want to continue reading it. The next chapter's out. I like the way he made such a bad situation kind of comical, if that makes sense. The author,
Yeah,
like everything was pretty bad, but you kind of laugh through it with the characters.
yeah. So it's for turning a lot of the difficult situations into they're relatable, they're human, they're humanized, and people in terrible situations, they still have to be human. They still laugh. So I think that's a good point there, that you make, that Denny. Angela writes, I thought it was a good read, very intense. It's indeed intense, and more about life after. So yeah, as you may have heard, Dave mentioned, there is a subsequent one, maybe two volumes that talk about life after the atomic bomb for the family. There was that one that survived the bombing. So you can look for those. Not sure if you can get them online, like you can get the Barefoot Again, the first one, but they're definitely out there and available. There are other thoughts about the book that Michael wrote that the ending was haunting. Haunting, yeah. So like let's sort of take a pause there. I see people who are sort of talking about this as a common feeling. So what was haunting about the ending of the book?
I thought the image of his family kind of like in the rubble there, and just like the fact they were calling. I mean, Jen couldn't really do anything about it. I thought that was pretty haunting.
So sort of powerless, helplessness. Um, that is a very sad image to see. I can go with that, and it's a hard place to sort of to move on from, for sure. Wells, and then Ellie.
I don't know if everybody had the same version as I did, but my version had like a essay by the author at the start, and it just talked about how that scene in particular actually happened to him. I'm pretty sure most of the things happened to him. It is supposed to be autobiography. He's again whatever, but that part he describes in the essay, and then like actually seeing in the book. I don't know. It was scary and like disturbing in the graphic novel part, but the essay to me was like so much more intense and like just shocking. And I'm wondering how like he was able to like get that distance where he could like draw this stuff, like his family burning alive or whatever, and like have it be like just not so dark and disturbing as it was like in his actual writing.
Yeah, he's written, and he's also talked in interviews a lot about how it was for him like therapeutic, right, to talk about the catastrophes that he had to endure, and to find a way to sort of try and tell his story. And he tried writing other ways, but it turned out that like drawing for him really was really necessary. So excuse me. So I guess that's one of the ways that it makes sense that he was able to sort of talk about and draw about this horrible tragedy, and allow us to then sort of see inside of his experience, making it again all the more haunting. Yeah. Ellie, you had your hand up.
So for me, I think a really interesting, and I don't want to say thematic because obviously since it actually happened, it's not as if it was just come up with for the sake of it, but I think it fit thematically very well how at the very end of the novel, even throughout like all of the death and destruction, you see that the baby that his mother has been carrying throughout the entire story, like through the war effort, through the bombing, through everything that they've been through, is born right after the fact. And I think it really marks like before and after, not not only in like a literary sense, but in a very real sense for the people who lived through that experience. Like there's no way that you'd be able to look back after the fact and not feel like it was a different time after going through something so traumatic. So I thought that
Mm.
that was a part that really personally stuck out to me, because like you see his mother throughout the whole thing thing like struggling and trying to do her best for the kids that she already has now, but also for the kid that she's going to have in the future. And so I think to see that at the very end was really powerful to me.
Yeah, I think that it's intentional, right? This um, division between before and after the bombing, and the baby again is, as you very accurately pointed out, is the sort of transition, um, the sort of marker that something new is going to happen. And I think babies are hopeful. I mean, that's the bottom line. Even in misery, humans, as sort of as a species, tend to find hope in the possibilities, and the potential of the future that babies represent. And so I think he decides to end his story there rather than ending just with, the horrors. He chooses to end with this other little element, and that I think is a really good point that you've made there, Ellie. Um, let's see. So Mai has written that she could never understand how he felt, but she could get a sense of how bad it was from his perspective. And then that's one of the things that a firsthand account can do, is really sort of convey the emotions that someone is feeling in that context. And he does that, I think, again and again. But that also is part of why we're able to appreciate his humor and his resilience and his strength, and not just his sadness. Um, all right, let's talk about. So what I want to do next, I want to actually ask you guys to work in groups just for a little bit, so we can sort of structure our discussion about these three categories for the essay. I asked you to identify the sort of social, economic, and physical impacts of the war on Japan. Uh, and so I think we're gonna get into groups and talk about these different categories. So I'm going to create some groups here, and I'm going to ask you to, in that group, talk about one of these three categories. And so using your essays, and using what you've written already, um, sort of try and come up with a few things that maybe you had in common with your classmates, in terms of, for example, social impacts, or that you had that were different. And I'll ask you about those in a few minutes. And another point I wanted to make. So the essay is due. The link is up. If you forgot to put it up before class, you want to put it up after class, that's fine. But if it comes in later than, let's say like 5 p.m. Your time, then it will be considered late unless you've already gotten in touch with your special circumstances. But we do want you to get this done and turn it in. There are quite a few of you who haven't finished, who haven't turned it in yet. So please, get it to us. We're looking forward to reading this and seeing how you engage with the reading. So just keep that in mind, and let's go to our groups. So you'll get an invite, just go to that group, and I will tell you each group what you're going to be discussing. All right? Okay. Go. Okay. So thank you for taking some time to talk to each other about Barefoot again and about the essay and about the historical context. So one of the things that we're trying to help you in this history class to get a handle on is history is the art of evidence-based argument, right? So you need to be able to bring evidence from your source before you make an argument. You can't just say what you think, right? Maybe you could do that in some other things like philosophy, but history, we're really trying to ask you to present evidence that you're drawing from your sources to make your point, to make your argument. And so when we're looking at an essay like this, or looking at your exams, which have a short and long essay, the same idea applies of you. We're asking you again to sort of be specific and give a detail, give information that you're drawing from your, in the case of this, from Barefoot again, but in another context, like on an essay for an exam, that would be from the textbook and from lectures, but to really sort of demonstrate your argument and not just say, things were bad, but to show us how they were bad and to give us that kind of evidence. So this exercise today was, a chance for us to sort of play in that space a little bit with evidence that you guys have brought together. So I'm going to just kind of allow at one time both groups that talked about a social or the economic or the physical aspects to share with us like what they came up with. So let's go with groups 1 and 2. First of all, what let me actually get my language, from the precise language from the exam, from the essay prompt. So I'm asking you to describe the social economical. Okay, so describe, right? So this is very broad. So yeah, what did you come up with in terms of social? An argument about the social impact of the war on Japan's people. For groups 1 and 2. So there's quite a few of you. So feel free to just jump in.
We talked about the social impact on the family and how they were labeled traitors because the father didn't support the war.
Okay, so the family treated as traitors. And would you call that a social impact?
Yeah, I would.
Sounds good to me. All right. What else did you guys come up with?
Naya said something really interesting about Mr. Pack, if she'd like to relay that information.
Yeah, I can. So I talked about how Mr. Pack was ostracized because he was a Korean man, and I also put other things in my essay about how Koreans were treated in their role in Japan during the war.
Okay, so that's a really good point, right? So since 1910, Korean citizens are Japanese citizens in in several ways, right? And so they're part of Japan's population, even though in fact they're treated as second-class citizens. And so they're definitely part of the population that you can discuss when you're talking about the impact of the war on people of Japan. So that is a really good point, is ostracization. Awesome. Okay. How about one more from this group? Or groups one or two, groups one or two on the social impacts.
Group one talked a lot about a lot of the nationalism that came forth as a result of the war. I'm not sure who it was, but somebody brought up how new generation of Japanese children labeled like children of the emperor.
Okay, that's a great example, right? So the sort of the ideological indoctrination happening to the children of Japan is definitely a social impact. And how do we see that in Barefoot again? Sure, Sam.
I wasn't a part of the group, but we can see it throughout Barefoot again with this ideal that your life is for the country itself, and the emperor and the country are one and the same. And that's echoed through like a couple times with like the citizens committing suicide rather than being captured by the American soldiers in two instances.
Okay, so the suicide stories and the sort of self-sacrifice that we see happening is the result of this kind of ideology. It's a concrete example of that. So that's really good. All right. Let's open up this up to everybody else, other groups as well. What other social impacts did you guys come up with that you found that we haven't talked about yet? If your cameras work, it'd be good to have them on, but if not, that's okay. So I can see if people want to raise their hand or and jump in. Yeah, Jack, go ahead.
One thing I talked about was how after they were labeled traitors, they kind of suffered like extrajudicial attacks from their neighbors. Like they threw the thing of clogs into the river, which meant that they couldn't afford food. The police like stole their potatoes one time. So I kind of just talked about how that environment meant that their neighbors could, attack them and commit crimes on them, without being caught or thrown in jail.
Okay, so like beyond ostracism, beyond sort of feeling, beyond feeling that you're not part of the group and you don't belong, they're being sort of persecuted, punished, mistreated by neighbors as well as by the police, and that I think is a great example. You kind of ask yourselves, I mean, why didn't Gin's dad just shut up? Why didn't he just fall in line? All right. Let's
Because
talk.
he didn't want to betray his principles.
His principles. So that is indeed what the author is trying to get across here, right? That his dad was somebody who had principles and was, he's an idealized version of his father that we can empathize with. But the reality is most Japanese did not, overtly oppose or criticize the ideologies that were presented. It's part of why sort of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan are oftentimes talked about together, because both these cultures, both of these countries were led by a small group of very influential, powerful, charismatic individuals towards atrocities and towards ideological atrocities as well. And for a while, we talked about in Japan, we discussed it as, the government sort of led the people of Japan into this black box, and they couldn't see out, they couldn't imagine a different reality. They were sort of hypnotized, right, by the ideology. And now, this is 2020. This kind of thinking doesn't work anymore. We have to really understand that people who do things like this, right, be it the military and the rip of Nanjing, or be it the treatment we see that's meted out to Mr. Nakaoka. These are people making choices, right? And it's more interesting to understand why they thought that and did that, and then sort of how they were led through some, sort of lack of agency to become like that. So those are some great, I think, social examples. Okay, let's switch gears, excuse me, and talk about the economic impacts. So this is for groups 3 and 4. Tell us a bit about what you guys come up with in terms of economic impacts of the war on Japan's people. Get my full grid view up here.
So, one impact that was very strongly felt was how all industry and people's employment shifted focus in order to support the war effort. Like all of the factories and like guns brothers and such like they were all producing for the war, either like weapons in the factory or farming in the countryside, and even people like the doctor who comes to treat Gen's mother is his profession is also affected, because even though he's not producing anything, he can't give the family medicine because it's all being sent to the front lines. So even though like he isn't being forced to directly produce for the war, his ability to like do his job properly is being affected by how other things are being distributed or not distributed to the everyday people, just like back in Japan itself.
Okay, so a great piece of evidence there of the doctor who comes to see Mrs. Nakaoka, who was unable because of the national general mobilization law and subsequent laws to because those laws have rationed and what's the word, have appropriated, right, all of the materials that the government needs for its war against the Western powers and against China, at the expense of its own citizens, their health. What other kinds of mobilization did you guys see in that group, in addition to medical supplies, for example? You must have examples of from the book of ways in which the national mobilization law impacted the people of Japan.
I think I kind of know what the question you're asking is. Was it like anything
Sure.
that had to do with agriculture, the government would buy really cheap and then they would sell it back to the like citizens and it'd be really expensive and nobody could really afford it. And that's why the black markets like came about.
Okay, right. So that's a great point, right? So thanks for that, Ashley. Right. So the government was actually even able sometimes to take without paying the food of the farming class. Sometimes they also did pay, and then to procure for yourself those same things, those kinds of goods, was extremely expensive. And also, there often wasn't a way to get the food, even if you had the money, right? And that's the black market was indeed an example of that, of where you could get, fresh produce that you couldn't get in your local markets, etc. Is there any mention in the book at all of black markets?
I think so. When they were coming home from the country and they were given like the sweet potatoes, the police officer stopped them and they were like, "Where'd you get these? Like, are they from the black market?" And he just kept like implying that they took them from the black market.
Perfect, right? So that example illustrates that, first of all, this was a reality, right? He was worried that they had gotten it from the black market because they existed, but also the kind of environment that's created by scarcity, an environment of fear and of mistrust and sort of suspicion and accusation. That's really an important element that we see here as well in that great example, Ashley. Great. Any other examples of economic impacts that you'd like to talk about from the groups 3 or 4 in particular? And if not you, the whole class can think about this question.
Well, it's kind of like, hold on, is it all right? The shopkeeper, Mr. Not, I forget his name, with the glass shop, how he wasn't able, because he actually went off into the war and was in the front line and fortunately, but unfortunately survived with, one leg and wasn't able to like just market himself out, I guess, and actually get the work he needed to feed his family. There was that. I talked on that.
That's a great example, right? So someone who has lost his leg could definitely be lumped in with the physical impacts, right? But you've done well to point out that it's also economic, right? Thinking about all of the men who are either killed or maimed during the war, who are unable then to exercise, their various careers and professions back in Japan, make a living, and support their families. So that is definitely an economic impact as well. So that's a great example, Denny. Denny, thank you for that. Let's actually sort of take a second and sort of mix economic and social up together and talk about at the level of the community, right? You guys talked about the neighbors and how they were mean, and the police were mean. I wanted sort of to ask you, where did all this come from? This sort of this attitude. How did this attitude towards the Nakaokas develop? How do we explain that looking, at the textbook in my lecture or lectures, and what you can get from Barefoot Kid? Interesting. Nam says famine. People were really hungry, so they did terrible things.
Yeah, I talked about famine. Devin helped me to better structure my essay, and that was one of the things I talked about.
Okay, so how does famine relate to the behavior of people like the chairman's family and the neighbors in general?
Oh, well, I didn't talk about that aspect of it. I talked about more of the economic aspect and how Japan was struggling through the European, the embargoes on oil and stuff. That's what I talked about.
That's huge, right? So if we're thinking about economics, the ABCD encirclement, the embargo from the US, Great Britain, China, and Holland, that cuts off oil supplies to Japan. It makes everything, sort of stop. All the cogs in the wheel are unable to function because they cannot, because the oil is mostly imported for Japan, is unavailable. The trucks that bring food from place to place, the trains, the um, the transportation from farm to city of produce, all these things rely upon fuel, which government is not cannot procure because of this embargo. So that's a great example that we see again and again. I think having an impact on the life of Gen and his family. Let's see. I saw more hands up, so I'll just sort of let you guys say what you wanted to say. Sam, sure.
Well, I wanted to say that going back to that idea of the famine is it's also more of the impact of like economic and social of the fact that now that the government is controlling all the I don't want to say controlling all the production, but they're redistributing the resources for the war effort, that now you have to feed into the site their nationalism or be ostracized because they're giving out the food, the rations, doing the supplies, or you have to resort to the black market. And I think that's what made this essay not hard, but sometimes a little difficult, because if you're talking about one issue, a lot of the issues that we're discussing all fall into all three categories, but you have to really narrow in and focus which aspect of the issue you want to discuss.
Yeah, that's a great point, right? As I mentioned with your comment, Danny, before, right? And I think hopefully you've all got a sense from this this project is that these pieces are all connected, right? The social and the economic and the physical, which we'll discuss in a second, they're all connected, and they can't really be separated. I mean, for the purposes of making a list, we can separate them and discuss them and look for some of their origins and sort of how they've developed over time. But they're all connected, right? And so they contribute to a general sort of poor situation in all those categories. But overall, for Japan, and we'll see that also happening for them mentally. Let's talk lastly for a little bit about the physical impacts of the war. So groups 5 and 6, what are some of the physical, concrete, physical impacts, perhaps on the bodies or on I don't know, on structures, or sort of these tangible impacts that you guys came up with?
Well, a common, I guess, theme was kind of like the impact of the atomic bomb and kind of how literally it leveled Japan, and kind of how, towards the end of the book, you very much see like the impact of like the radiation and the fire, as people are burning and people are dying from radiation. Other physical impacts that we talked about was kind of like the effects of starvation, and kind of like the idea of like domestic poverty, how kind of that, because the government was kind of hoarding food for more upper class individuals and soldiers, it kind of left um, traditional families and kind of more impoverished communities more barren, in the sense how they were kind of on the brink of starvation, especially in, I believe it was Nagasaki or Osaka, I think is one of the places they said.
Yeah, so I mean, so this is a story of Hiroshima, but the the starvation is happening throughout the country.
Yeah.
And Osaka is definitely one of the areas that, because it was sort of the breadbasket and Japan's secondary center for the economy, place where people suffered a lot. So those are good points. Let's add a few more of the physical impacts to what Faris has, I think, very eloquently stated about starvation, and also about the impacts of radiation and the bomb, those kinds of things. Let's see. forget who was in which group, so it's a bit complicated. Anyone else want to volunteer to add to the list? Wells, yeah.
I think probably the most obvious physical impacts are the bombing of major cities, including the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and also just like Tokyo and a lot of metropolitan areas just getting totally reduced to rubble, like that picture that we saw in class, and also just the death toll numbers. So you can see in the textbook, I actually forget the figure, but I think it's like 2.5 million Japanese people died throughout this war effort, and then it also gives figures about the amount of people that died, like in Japan, citizens that died, and they're pretty shocking. I think it's like close to 1 million total with the 2 atomic bombings plus all the other air raids. So those are the 2 physical impacts I chose to look at, was like cities being destroyed and people dying.
Okay, so great point, right? So Japan has worked so hard as a national polity, right, to develop and become more like Western countries, to have cities that the world can look at and be impressed by, the Western world in particular. They have brick buildings and stone buildings. They have, subways and trolley cars, streetcars. They have, just very modern systems of transportation on canals and on roads. All this has been built up over the past, like from 1868, very precisely on the 1945. And then here we see that this, one of the impacts of the war is that these places are devastated by atomic bombs that destroy people, but also space, right? If you go to Japan today and you visit Nagasaki, for example, or if you visit, actually for that matter, Hiroshima, they've worked very hard to sort of rebuild and change the tenor of these spaces. But they're still very much emptied out spaces that have never been fully replaced. And so that, I think, speaks to the physical impact on Japan as a physical place that we see here, taking place because of the bombings and the fire bombing of Tokyo as well, does that to the capital. So great points there. Well, so let's talk for like the last few minutes. So I think that a good essay might have tried to sort of tie these 3 things together, but it's not necessary. You could have talked about things that were sort of separate for you in your mind. But at some point, we also ask ourselves, the Japanese suffered through all of this. Why did so few Japanese stand up like Mr. Nagaoka did? Why did so few Japanese resist?
It could be also out of fear, or just like either they're playing like loyalty to the government, or it's fear of because other people like in the book, they knew how the family was treated, and they obviously don't want to be called a traitor. They definitely do love their country, but that doesn't necessarily mean they have to agree with everything that the government says. But obviously they don't want to get treated terribly.
So that's a great point, Angela. A lot of fear, right? So maybe fear being a bigger factor than the loyalty that they had received through, the imperial educational rescript and through readings of Kokutai no Hongi, those kinds of things. But I guess another question would be, this fear seems to also be very much based, as you said, Angela, around people, around your neighbors, right? About people who are nearby you. So why, back to my question I was kind of asking before, why do we end up with such a, sort of at the local level, so much fear amongst neighbors, between neighbors? How do we explain that? Let me sort of see. How about like people I haven't heard from a little bit today? How about are you there, Ali?
Me?
Yeah, any ideas on sort of how we explain this sort of fear amongst people in the same neighborhood that drives them to treat each other with such sort of, disrespect and to not be neighborly?
I definitely think it definitely comes down to like what you said, fear, and kind of like they're all kind of trying to protect themselves because this is a time of great like anxiety and stuff like that. So I'm thinking like just that if they hear that like that their neighbors might not be like acting in a way to support the war, that could definitely trigger like fear and a desire to distance themselves from people who don't seem to have like the emperor centric, Japan centric mindset at the forefront.
Okay. Yeah. So fear and a very concrete fear, and out of that, the worry about being themselves associated with that kind of thinking. I think that we assumed that in Japan there was sort of a very powerful state that was going in people's homes and was looking for bad literature. I mean, that really didn't happen so much. Really, what happens is people of Japan, across Japan, right? They carried that out on their own, right? They sort of embraced, largely out of fear, and out of sort of mutual surveillance networks that were created, the sort of five family networks that were created, and the neighborhood committees. It is sort of that level of very localized and temporary power that through which the government is able to instill this fear and then to have people react and act in these ways. So I think that I think as we look towards other countries, other empires, and we try and understand how people will react. I mean, you don't know how you'll react. You don't know how you're going to behave in a situation like this. But what is clear is that a lot of the machinery for this kind of ideological development, right, was put in place throughout the late Meiji period, and 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 we talked about the ideologies that were being taught at the Naval Academy, the Army Academy, the Imperial University. We also talked about the increasing lack of dissent that was possible without being fired or imprisoned. And so it is the when there are fewer alternatives, right, that are allowed, we do see people become more and more afraid, even if in fact there's not a lot of chance that in your country, community, talking about the emperor badly would be sought out by the thought police. So it really is very effective in the case of Japan, and it does lead to collaboration, cooperation, but also eventually to war. So I think we're going to go ahead and stop there for today. Thank you all for taking part in this activity and our discussion, for your essays. Be sure and get those to me today, or if not today, later on, but with a small penalty. I hope you have a good afternoon. Thanks for class, guys.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Have a great rest of your day.
All right, thanks, Ferris.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I had one quick question, Professor.
Sure, Sam.
I I actually forgot my bibliography at the end. I did in-text citations like the last essay, but I just forgot the bibliography. Would you like me to just quickly upload a big bibliography onto my essay, or?
Sure. Yeah, you can.
Okay.
That would be helpful. That way we'll
Cool.
know what you're referring to each time.
Yep.
That's
All right.
good.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Sam.
All right. Bye.
Bye. All right. Devin, how are things?
Things are going good. I'll try and get a start on grading essays by the end of this week. But other than that, no issues.
Okay. Yeah. Stop the recording.